To raise the money, each and every senator of the Roman Senate agreed to contribute some of his personal wealth. But they started squabbling and they started fighting among each other, and none of them wanted to contribute. So eventually the sum came up short. There wasn't enough gold and silver to meet the demands of Alaric. So they were forced to start melting down pagan statues of their gods, which were covered with gold and some of them were made of silver. So they started melting down those statues and dismantling their own shrines in order to make up the difference. And there is a
That is
story.
crazy.
Yeah, there's an account by an historian at the time called Zosmius. He reports that one of those statues which they melted was of Virtus. Virtus was the god of courage in battle, and they had to melt him down in order to placate the Visigoths. And he says that when it was melted down to pay the barbarians, it seems as though all that remained of the Roman valor was extinguished with it. Just imagine that you take the god which represents courage in battle and you use it, you melt it down in order to pay the barbarians so they don't slaughter you. Like, that's just such a display of weakness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know what a good modern equivalent would be other than if we melted down the Statue of Liberty to try and pay off some debt to some country that was attacking us. I mean, so that was a really strong sign that they were reaching the end of their rope when they melted that statue down.
That's an amazing comparison because for them, for the Romans, courage in battle was the highest value. And for Americans, present day Americans, liberty is the
Freedom.
highest value. So if you melt down the Statue of Liberty in order to satisfy someone else, some foreign power, that means you have given up on liberty.
Hello and welcome. Thanks for tuning in today. In this video, we are going to do a follow-up to our previous video about similarities between Rome and the US. We ended with a discussion of the crisis of the 3rd century and the hyperinflation, as well as the Edict of Maximum Prices, with which Emperor Diocletian tried to stop the inflation in 301 AD. Well, after that, the empire went on existing for another 200 years until about 476 AD, but it was greatly weakened by this economic collapse. Now we are going to talk about the collapse itself and the role the Visigoths as well as gold and silver played in the end. Could modern society collapse like ancient Rome did? Stay tuned to hear about these topics. For this conversation, it's an honor to have Oren Elbaz back here with me once again. He is an economist and a sound money advocate hailing from Israel. Oren, welcome back.
Hello, how do you do?
Doing great. It's great to speak with you again tonight. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. Very excited to talk about this topic, which I find to be absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, this is a very interesting topic, and I think our listeners are going to enjoy it as well. Before the collapse of Rome, the Visigoths had started to become a real problem. It's speculated that they were taking advantage of internal revolts in Rome that had left Rome more vulnerable in that time period.
Yes. So Rome was attacked by barbaric tribes throughout its history. This wasn't news for them, but they always managed to repel them. And the might of the Roman army, the might of their legions was, it was famous. And those tribes were truly fearful of the Romans. But things changed in the late fourth century when those Goths invaded the Roman Empire. And for the first time in history, they were not repelled. The empire wasn't able to repel them. Now, the story is that they migrated into the Roman Empire due to the invasion of the Huns into their territory, which forced them to leave, which forced them to enter regions of the Roman Empire. And the emperor at the time was called Valens, tried to destroy them. And there was a battle in 378 AD called the Battle of Adrianople, but he was defeated by them and he died in battle, which of course was a huge shock because it was very, very rare that a Roman emperor would die in battle. And his successor, who was called Theodosius, pretty much had no alternative but to allow them to stay. And there was kind of an agreement between the Goths and the Romans that they would stay as Roman subjects and they would, pay taxes, serve in the Roman army, and in return they would have autonomy. So Theodosius manages to stabilize matters, but still, this is a first sign of weakness that the Roman Empire is unable to repel an invading tribe.
Right. And so sometimes if you can't beat them, join them is the idea. And so some of these Visigoths started getting command positions within the Roman military in this time period, is my understanding.
Yes, but the Romans never gave them real positions of power. They kind of exploited them. There was kind of a bit of racism towards them because they were considered of low background. They weren't cultured enough. They weren't sophisticated like the Roman aristocrats. So the Romans looked down at them, and the Visigoths were always incensed by that, that they never managed to, really be incorporated into Roman society. I want to mention that at the time, the Roman Empire was split into two. There was the western part and the eastern part, and it was Diocletian himself, we mentioned him, that invented this system. It was meant so that they could better rule because the empire was so large, so huge. They wanted to have two emperors, one in the west, one in the east, so that they would be able to respond more quickly to events, to a crisis in their region. And this system was called the Tetrarchy. It relied on two emperors and their successors, so that if the emperor dies, there's going to be a successor immediately, someone to replace him. And this system, well, it was a nice idea, but it didn't really work because even though there was a designated successor at each and every point in time, they didn't respect the decision of the deceased emperor, and there was some treachery, and there were some revolts, and eventually this didn't last long. When Theodosius died, he left the two parts of the empire to his two sons. He had two sons. One was called Arcadius. He was supposed to rule the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now know as the Byzantine Empire. And his son Honorius was supposed to be the emperor of the West. But they were young at the time and they weren't powerful enough to rule themselves. They needed to rely on generals and advisors. So that's another reason why the empire was in a weak spot.
Weak leadership. No, absolutely. So in 394, that was the first battle where I had heard of Alaric, the Visigoth leader, at the Battle of the Frigidus River.
Yes,
He had been put on the front lines, and his guys took a lot of heavy
casualties.
tolls because of that. Yeah, they took a lot of casualties. After this, he was pretty upset with how that all happened, and he started raising an army again. And he had been out raiding in the Balkans, and they had offered him a command position, which chilled him out for a little bit. But then he started raiding again, and he asked for more. He asked to be supreme commander of the Roman military.
Yes, just imagine what an absurd position is to have like this army within your country, within your empire, which is not exactly faithful to the empire. Its allegiance depends on, constantly bribing them because they don't feel themselves as true Romans and as though conquering it from within.
That would be an insane position to be in. But what a weird political situation to be in. And yeah, I couldn't imagine living in a country that was operating like that.
And
But
the
it's
Roman Empire was forced to put up with it because they didn't have the military power to destroy them, to expel them from the empire, just had to put up with them.
right.
So Honorius, the Western emperor, he relied on a powerful general who was called Stilicho. And Stilicho, he was a member of his family because he married his cousin Serena. And he was a powerful leader and a resourceful leader who was able to navigate all those tribes who were surrounding the empire and sometimes penetrating, sometimes conquering parts of the empire. He managed to somehow keep things together. But in 408 AD, he was accused of treason and he was executed. Him and his son were put to death. And one of the reasons I'm figuring out that because he was half Roman and half Vandal, Vandals were another tribe which the Romans were fighting
Germanic
with.
origin.
Yes. So because he was half Roman and half Vandal, he wasn't truly accepted by the Roman aristocracy. There was a hint of racism there. Although he was a very competent leader, he was put to death. And this made situation even worse because now there was no strong leadership to replace him.
Yeah, that had to be the beginning of the end for them because it does make me wonder if because he was part Vandal, if that was helping him have a better understanding of how to negotiate with the Visigoths. He wasn't a purely of Roman origin. And like you were saying, he was a competent leader. He was someone that was there to protect Rome, and they put him to death. And in the
Yes.
winter of 408, Alaric starts a siege on Rome.
Yes. So Alaric sees that there's a power vacuum. So he can just, march on Rome. Now, we have to explain at the time, the emperor, the Western emperor, wasn't situated in Rome itself. The court, the imperial court, was moved to Ravenna, which was easier to defend. And Italy itself was left unprotected. And so Alaric starts marching south towards Rome and he sacks cities, he destroys cities on his way. And Rome itself is just fearful, and the Roman Senate is fearful of what is going to happen. And they are hoping for, Honorius to send help, but he does nothing. He just leaves that city, which is at the time the greatest city in the world with close to 1 million inhabitants, just
Huge
leaves it.
population,
Yeah, just leaves it to the mercy of the Visigoths.
just
And
undefended. Yeah.
yeah, undefended. And so what happens is the Visigoths arrive and they lay siege to the city. And of course, Rome at the time was dependent on constant import of food with ships that sailed up the Tiber River. And as a result of this siege, you had famine inside Rome. It was protected by those huge walls. The people defended themselves behind walls, but they were starving.
Right. And then you think about all the people in the big cities today. If the supply chains dry up, what is going to happen to these huge population centers?
Yes, that's exactly one of the reasons why this is so reminiscent of today, because today we have large cities such as New York cities who rely on constant imports of food almost on a daily basis just to
Absolutely.
sustain themselves. And if for some reason the supply of food stops, then you're probably going to have chaos within 48 hours.
Right. And nobody wants to end up in that situation.
So what happens is that the Roman Senate sends envoys to Alaric to negotiate with them. And Alaric is willing to lift the siege if the Romans give him all their gold and silver.
Yes. That sounds like a smart man. He knew what to go after.
So he thinks to himself, why do I even need to fight this battle? If the Romans are going to give me all their gold and silver, I'm just going to take it. He also wants them to free all the barbarian slaves because they had many barbarian slaves there of Germanic origin. And if the slaves are free, then they're going to probably join his
Get some fresh recruits.
yeah,
Yeah.
fresh recruits. So, okay, so we have an account of what happened during those negotiations, and one envoy asked what would be left to the citizens of Rome, and Alaric replies, "Their lives. They will be left with their lives. They should be happy with that."
Yeah, he was in there to plunder everything. And so, how much gold and silver was given to them?
Okay, so eventually they came to an understanding that the Goths will receive 5,000 pounds of gold and 30,000 pounds of silver in exchange for lifting the siege. Now, we should point out that we're probably talking about a Roman pound, which was smaller than a present day pound, than the modern pound. It was equal to 327 grams. And therefore, I calculate that this amounts to 1.6 metric tons of gold and 9.8 metric tons of silver, which in today's prices, it amounts to about $140 million worth of gold and $10 million worth of silver.
Wow.
Now, that may sound like a huge sum, but mind you, in order to save the largest city of the world, that's not such a huge sum of money. Think about New York, for instance, present day New York. Just the wealth and the buildings and the art which exists in New York City nowadays, it's in the trillions.
Oh yeah. Well, and compared to like modern central banks, I mean, to be in the top 10 globally, you would need to have, if I remember correct, off just offhand, over 615 tons of gold in your central bank to get in the world top 10. So by modern standards, that yeah, these aren't very big numbers,
Yes.
but for their hoard, it was probably, seemed pretty significant at the time.
Yes, for them it was very significant, but it strikes me as interesting that compared to, present day prices of gold and silver, it's not such a huge sum in order to save the greatest city in the world at the time.
Yeah, a major city. Imagine if I don't know, let's just say if there was a major city here in the US under siege and we were looking at going to a long war, something like the Ukraine-Russia situation, or we could just pay 140 million and they'd leave. Well, that would probably be more cost effective for us today than fighting it out with those
Yeah,
people.
I think it's an indication that the price of gold and silver is currently very low, that they are extremely undervalued. It's yet another indication of how undervalued they were. I mean, like if you were to
Absolutely.
ransom a city for 10 times as much, let's say $1.5 billion. Now that sounds like a more reasonable sum to me.
Sure.
And perhaps
Absolutely.
that would be on the low side as well. Who knows?
And we
So
do know that silver is extremely undervalued. That does speak a lot to that. Okay, clearly, the purchasing power is much higher in that era.
yes. So it's interesting that to raise the money, each and every senator of the Roman Senate agreed to contribute some of his personal wealth. But they started squabbling and they started fighting among each other, and none of them wanted to contribute. So eventually the sum came up short. There wasn't enough gold and silver to meet the demands of Alaric. So they were forced to start melting down pagan statues of their gods, which were covered with gold and some of them were made of silver. So they started melting down those statues and dismantling their own shrines in order to make up the difference. And there is a
That is
story,
crazy.
yeah, there's an account by an historian at the time called Zosmius. He reports that one of those statues which they melted was of Virtus. Virtus was the god of courage in battle, and they had to melt him down in order to placate the Visigoths. And he says that when it was melted down to pay the barbarians, it seems as though all that remained of the Roman valor was extinguished with it. But just imagine that you take the god which represents courage in battle and you use it, you melt it down in order to pay the barbarians so they don't slaughter you. Like that's just such a display of weakness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know what a good modern equivalent would be other than if we melted down the Statue of Liberty to try and pay off some debt to some country that was attacking us. I mean, so that was a really strong sign that they were reaching the end of their rope when they melted that statue down.
That's an amazing comparison because for them, for the Romans, courage in battle was the highest value. And for Americans, present day Americans, liberty is the
Freedom.
highest value. So if you melt down the Statue of Liberty in order to satisfy someone else, some foreign power, that means you have given up on liberty.
Yeah, absolutely. If something like that's happening, pretty much you're done at that point.
So what happens next is that they take the gold and the silver and they simply leave. And Rome is intact, Rome is saved. That happened in 408 AD. But it signaled weakness to other tribes also. Because until that point in time, Rome was considered to be so mighty, so great, that you can never conquer it. It was an eternal city which reigned over the world for 1,000 years.
Right.
And just imagine other tribes hearing that, hey, this guy Alaric went to Rome and laid siege on it and got all their gold and silver in as ransom. It's just amazing. It completely shatters the
Their
image
image of Rome.
of
Yeah,
Rome as a powerful empire.
absolutely. I mean, it says a lot that that city that had been controlling the world for so long was laid siege to, and all their statues were melted down. In particular, the pagan statues, is my understanding, is what they were melting down.
Perhaps it's a good time to mention that at the time, Rome was the seat of the papacy. The Christianity was the formal religion of the empire. But some of the citizens of Rome were still pagans. They
Right.
still worshipped pagan gods, but it was done mainly in private. They weren't allowed to do it in public.
Well, and it probably was very psychologically damaging to see these old statues that, if nothing else, they felt that they had historic value in their society, that it was part of their Roman history, part of their Roman culture. Even though my understanding is they weren't melting down the Christian statues, but they were melting down these statues, which had been symbols of pride for Rome for a long time and had stood for a long time.
Yes. Now, if I'm trying to connect this to what is happening today, so as we said at the time, Rome was overrun by invading tribes, those Germanic tribes. And today we have, it's not the same thing, but we do have mass immigration into Europe, into the United States by immigrants who don't necessarily share the values of the local population. And that is important because it creates these tensions between the locals and the immigrants.
Right. And then you have cultures that, some aspects of them might not necessarily be compatible, trying to coexist with each other and figuring out, what can we accept and what are we willing to let go, and should they respect these laws that don't exist in the countries where they came from? Is this going to be damaging to our traditions? So there is some similarity there. The weird
Yes.
thing about today is it's so controlled. It almost seems like there's an outside force paying off various politicians to pass these laws to immigrate all these people, because in the Roman times this was much more just tribes moving around Europe coming into conflict with each other, whereas today, I mean, these people are being given plane tickets and boat tickets, and they're coming from a really long ways away, as opposed to just moving across the same continent they're already on. But nonetheless, I guess regardless of how they got here, that there is a similarity there.
Yes, and it's creating tensions within the population between locals and newcomers, and there's this lack of social cohesion. I think it's another factor which contributes to the fall.
Yeah, I think that you're totally right. And on top of that, other things that can cause societal collapse, natural disasters. We've been seeing a lot of natural disasters recently in the United States. We've had these huge fires in California, and I'm not sure what it's going to look like once it's all said and done. The dust settles, all the ashes are cleaned up. A lot of value was just burned to the ground in the Los Angeles area. And so it's pretty staggering to have that much real estate all burned down in one sitting. So I don't know how much help they're going to be able to give to these people. I'm not sure what is going to happen to all of the loans because a lot of those properties aren't going to be paid off. Are the banks going to eat this? It'll be really interesting to see what happens. But natural disasters can be a big problem for
Yes.
countries.
Yes. So societal collapse, as you say, it is sometimes associated with a natural disaster, but it could also be the result of war, of a plague, of famine, of bad leadership, or a combination of all those factors. And it's perhaps a good time to discuss the theories around this concept of societal collapse. First of all, I want to say that this is not fiction, okay? This is not science fiction. This is not some kind of a movie because it actually happens. We
Yeah,
have
this has happened to societies.
yeah, we have historical accounts of societies which collapsed. I'm just going to mention a few. For instance, there's the late Bronze Age collapse. There's the Easter Island culture, which collapsed. There's the Mayan Empire, from South America. And of course, the fall of the Roman Empire is the ultimate example, which we talk about because it's near and dear. This is the culture which inspired Western civilization. So some of those civilizations, they go through what we call a dark age. So they have this major decline, and later they manage to recover. Okay, perhaps it's not exactly the same form or the same language or the same customs, but it is the same civilization, just as Western civilization is the daughter of the Roman Empire. But some cultures disappear completely, and we have evidence of that. So I want to mention a very important concept, which is the idea of decline in complexity. When we talk about the collapse of a civilization, it is characterized by it becoming less complex. What do we mean when we say a complex society? It has all sorts of functions which a simple agrarian society wouldn't have. For instance, having a court system. When you have a bunch of peasants living in a village somewhere, they don't necessarily need a court. Even if they are fighting between them, they can come to agreements between them. They don't necessarily need a courtroom and a judge and all those lawyers.
Right. All those lawyers are replaced with 10 guys with pitchforks.
Because essentially, what does it mean that we nowadays have a court system and we have those judges and we have all those lawyers? These guys are not creating food. They're not creating any tangible commodity. And that means that the people who do need to somehow feed them.
Right. They need the larger society to exist in the positions that they do, the larger
So,
complex
because
society.
eventually everyone needs to eat. So, all those functions that we have in a modern complex society, such as universities, such as the media, such as even high-tech industries, they need someone to feed them. The more complex the society becomes, the fewer people you have who are actually engaged in agriculture and feeding the rest of society.
Right.
So a collapse of society is associated with a rapid decline in the amount and the sophistication of those roles. Everyone is forced into subsistence farming because there's famine, because there's just fewer resources. So everybody is forced to leave whatever they're doing and go back to the fields and try to make a living. And that means that universities are abandoned. That means that courts are abandoned because nobody's, has the resources to maintain these institutions.
Right. And then, all those little fun products, the plastic back scratcher makers, you name it, the guys who make squeezies for cups, yeah, all these little things suddenly, no one really needed those to begin with. It was just a convenience thing.
Yeah, think
And
about all the entertainment industry. Think about Hollywood and all those TV stations. If you are going through a crisis in which people are hungry and there is no food and they all become obsolete, nobody needs them. So nobody's going to maintain them. So what we
right.
see during a collapse is a complex society suddenly becoming a simpler one.
And what's interesting about that is already a lot of the preppers, they're all interested in growing their own food. They all want to have at least a good sized garden, and some of them have much bigger food operations. So it's interesting because it's almost like people subconsciously are preparing for this already, even though they don't have to, even though they can still go to the grocery stores right now
Yes.
and work their 9 to 5 job. But I do think that's really interesting.
Now, another important point is that, we assume nowadays that we remember how to do all those sophisticated things. And even if we do abandon the courts and the universities, then within a few years after things stabilize and we manage to produce enough food, then we're going to be able to return and, reinstate the judges and, have those TV stations again up and running. But what happens is if you abandon all these institutions, then after a generation or two of that, the technology is forgotten.
That's really interesting.
We need to realize that a lot of the knowledge that we have, how to produce things, it is held within the memory of actual people. And when you go to work at a factory, for instance, you're going to have someone who's been working there for a few years, who has this knowledge, and he's going to teach you how to produce those gadgets.
Right.
You're not going to sit around with books or manuals. Perhaps some people perhaps do sit around with books and manuals, but within a few generations, even the books, even the manuals are going to be lost, destroyed in a fire, or just lost, just abandoned. Nobody's going to find them. And what we see during a collapse of a civilization is that technologies are forgotten. Nowadays, we are used to seeing technology only advance. We have never seen society going back in its technological sophistication. We haven't seen it with our own eyes, so we can't even imagine how it would look like and how it would feel like losing things that we're used to. So we have the theory of Professor Joseph Tainter. He's very famous in this field. You could say that he laid down the groundwork for this entire field of research regarding the collapse of civilizations. And the gist of his theory is that there is such a thing as a diminishing return on social complexity. And I'll try to explain it. It's not that complicated. The idea is that as society grows, as society becomes more complex, it solves problems using this idea of creating functions within society, like the ones we mentioned, the court system and the academia and the media. But we pay a price for each of these functions.
Right.
Yeah, it means that fewer and fewer people who are actually engaged in producing food need to sustain more and more people who are engaged in other things. And he argues that at first there is benefit to it. Society benefits from having those complexities, but as time goes on, there is less and less benefit to society from adding more and more functions. And at a certain point, you arrive at that stage of corruption in which you increase the complexity of society, although it brings no benefit. For instance, bureaucracy. If you add more and more bureaucrats, more and more government officials, each and one of them gets a nice salary and a nice pension, and they bring no benefit. At a certain point, they bring no benefit. As a matter of fact, they're only hurting the economy because they're creating all those rules and regulations which complicate business for average folks to the point that the economy is paralyzed.
Yeah, they're just a burden on the people that are actually producing things oftentimes.
Yes, we have reached a point in which we have a diminishing return on social complexity, and eventually this could absolutely collapse our economy, just like the Roman economy collapsed during the third century. And eventually, this could even lead to a complete societal collapse. So, if it gets bad enough to the point that we can't feed ourselves and people leave their offices, yes, they leave the schools, they leave their high-tech jobs, and they go out to the fields and they start farming again because there's no food to buy at the supermarket. This is the essence of a collapse.
Right. I mean, you're in bad shape if there is no food at the supermarket, either that or your wages aren't providing you enough income to buy the food from the supermarket, and it's time for you to go out and survive on your own again. It's very odd because that's also kind of the groundwork for the starting of a society is everyone can feed themselves. And then they start organizing and say, okay, great. Well, now that we have this extra abundance, we can start getting people more specialized. And so you're just watching all of that revert. And my understanding is after the fall of Rome, the people there had lost the ability to manufacture ceramics, bricks, to work with iron. I mean, that's really interesting stuff.
There is a professor called Professor Brian Ward Perkins, and he is both an historian and an archaeologist, and he studied Roman archaeological sites before and after the collapse of Rome. And the interesting things that he noticed is that they actually lost certain technologies which we assume to be basic, like the manufacture of ceramics, because we take for granted articles which are made of ceramics, such as pots, such as bricks, such as roof tiles. But in fact, there is certain technology behind them. You need to burn those items, you need to burn them in a kiln at certain temperatures in order to make them waterproof. And this is a technique which, after the fall of Rome, was lost. And for a while, certainly in distant provinces of the empire, such as Britain, they didn't have that ability for like 200 or 300 years.
That's really interesting. That's a long time to be without those
Yes.
basic things, bricks, pots, roof tiles.
Yes. He
Uh,
also mentions other things which disappear, such as everything that has to do with iron, the ability to work with iron. There are no nails found in the archaeological sites after the fall of Rome. And there's also an
Yikes.
interesting thing that he mentions is a huge decline in the amount of coinage. Because in every Roman site, you find plenty of coins. Even the simple, I'm not talking about the denarii, the silver coins, I'm talking about the simple bronze coins, which they used for change.
Right.
They simply disappear after the collapse of Rome, which perhaps indicates that they stopped trading with each other, that they reverted to barter.
Yeah, you need a sack of potatoes. I got a couple chickens. You want to make a trade? You know, they had to go back to these types of transactions, and that's totally crazy. And that the thing about those situations is it's very hard to gauge value. And so a lot of times these things aren't going to go as smooth as it might seem like, if it's a good friend or, a neighbor you get along with well, maybe that's fine. But it is hard to figure out what that equivalency is. And even with silver coins, there could be some difficulty in those situations. What would the true value of that silver be in my mind during a collapse? What would the value of that silver be in his mind during the collapse? And I'm sure that everything would work out, but these things might be a little tricky.
And one last thing that I want to mention as evidence for the decline is that you see a dramatic drop in the amount of the population because Rome was a city of about 1 million people at its height. And during medieval times, it was reduced to 20,000 people.
That's unreal.
At the end of the 6th century, they say Rome declined to 20,000 people. And at the time, it was considered still a large city.
That's really interesting. I bet it was odd to go into that city, because even though a lot of stuff had burned down. I'm sure there was still a lot of evidence that it had been much larger at one point, and I bet you that was a creepy feeling to go into Rome when there was only
Yes,
20,000 people living there.
yes, the citizens of Rome at the time, during the Middle Ages, they were surrounded by all those relics, all those ruins from the Roman era. And they didn't use all those beautiful buildings because they couldn't maintain them. They didn't have the ability, the resources in order to maintain them. So they just lay in ruin and they just got destroyed. And they even used some of the bricks, some of the stones in order to construct their own buildings, their own small houses. So you had the mighty Roman Forum. They just constructed all those houses along the forum. This beautiful square of ancient times became this shanty town.
Kind of a slum.
Yeah, this mass of hovels.
That's really interesting. Well, and I guess you might as well reclaim the bricks if you're in that situation.
One more thing, where they didn't have stones and bricks to reclaim from ancient buildings, they moved to building with wood. And after the fall of Rome, you mainly see wooden buildings, which of course don't last as long.
That's very interesting. And or more cost effective to put up. And so it stayed like that for hundreds of years. Is that correct? With the
Yes.
buildings being made out of wood?
It took them hundreds of years to return to the level of technology and sophistication which the Roman had. And one of the best examples is that the Romans invented concrete.
It was very good concrete as well, made out of volcanic ash.
Yes, it's not the exact same concrete that we use today, but they did have concrete, and it was forgotten. People didn't know how to make concrete until the 18th century. So this secret was lost for over 1,000 years.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, their concrete was really good. I sometimes wonder if the modern age structural grade concrete is even up to par with what they were making with the volcanic ash a long time ago in Rome.
Yes, and to this day, we have the largest unreinforced dome, which is made of concrete at the Pantheon in Rome, one of the largest surviving Roman structures.
That is so cool.
Yeah. Okay, so last theory that I want to mention regarding the collapse of civilizations comes from a 14th century Arab philosopher called Ibn Khaldun. So Ibn Khaldun talked more about, the values of society, and he tried to explain the decline of civilizations through the lens of their values. So he argued that a civilization begins as a nomadic tribe which, has a very hard life in the desert in very harsh conditions. And those harsh conditions, they forge good values of courage and self-sufficiency, independence, having strong character. And those attributes, they help the tribe conquer a large civilization which is in decline. So they take over the city and the city dwellers. They are weak and they are fat and they have no fighting spirit. And so the nomadic tribe is able to take over the city dwellers. But as it turns out, after a generation or two of living in the city, those values are gradually eroded and forgotten.
And then they become the fat city dwellers,
Yes, exactly. And until another nomadic tribe comes along and takes over them.
right?
And, we can sum it up. This theory can be summed up. There's this famous sentence: hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. And weak men create hard times. So there's this cycle in which times of hardship, they reinvigorate those values that we have forgotten of how to be courageous, how to be self sufficient. And then, thanks to these values, we're able to reconstruct our societies. But when we forget these values, we could just as easily revert to the hard times. And I'm afraid that this is exactly what we're seeing today.
That was very insightful for him to have drawn those conclusions such a long time ago. And we all see it happening today.
Yes, well, we arrive at the conclusion of our story, which is the sack of Rome. So, as we've said, Alaric plundered the gold and the silver of Rome in 408 AD, but it didn't satisfy him for long. Of course, after you get a taste of that gold and silver, you come back for some more. So he soon started threatening to lay siege on Rome again. And Honorius, Emperor Honorius, this time rallied his troops and he sent 6 legions to protect the city. But their commander, he was kind of foolhardy. Instead of protecting himself behind the mighty walls of Rome, he went into battle. He marched into Visigoth territory and he was outnumbered and his troops were absolutely destroyed. And only a handful of them managed to escape and return back to Rome. So that was another defeat which the Romans took. And later, after some more negotiations with Honorius, which failed, eventually in 410 AD, Alaric and his troops arrive again at the gates of Rome. And this time they cannot be placated, this time they cannot be bribed to leave the city alone. And on August 24th, they enter Rome, and this is absolutely terrible what is happening there. They pillage the city for 3 days, killing, raping, destroying many monuments. For instance, the mausoleums, both of Augustus and Adrian, those great emperors, and they just throw away their ashes. Their ashes are scattered, and they just, they take all the precious possessions, all the gold and silver items which are within these buildings. Everything is stolen. And the only 2 monuments which are spared, by the way, are the 2 major churches, the 2 major basilicas of St. Peter's and St. Paul's. And that's because the Visigoths themselves were Christians. So they spared those 2 mighty churches. But many Roman aristocrats are taken captive, including the emperor's own sister, Galla Placidia. That was her name, Galla Placidia. She is also taken captive, and some were ransomed, and others were sold into slavery. And you have refugees from Rome fleeing the city, going to all sorts of other provinces, such as provinces in North Africa and in the East, the Eastern Roman Empire. Even some of them arrive here at Israel.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting.
yes, there are accounts of monks who accepted refugees from Rome in their monasteries here in the Holy Land. The stories are terrible. These are people who were very powerful, very rich, aristocratic, who lost everything, who found themselves as refugees, just scattered all across the Mediterranean, looking for some place of refuge. And Rome is not completely destroyed. It continues to exist, and the empire continues to exist for a few more decades. As you said, Alaric leaves the city and dies very soon after, probably from some kind of disease. But the Visigoths, they become, entrenched within the Roman Empire, and you have all sorts of warring tribes just eating away at the remnants of the empire. And this is pretty much the end. Now, there's this amazing story, this an absolutely amazing story demonstrating the lack of leadership at the time. The historian Procopius records a story that on hearing the news that Rome had perished, Honorius, the Emperor Honorius, was initially shocked, thinking that the messenger was speaking about his favorite chicken, which was also called Rome. Yes, it
That's
is
so
amazing.
crazy.
Yes, that's so crazy because Honorius, so it turns out, that was his hobby. He raised chickens. And Rome, that was the name of his favorite chicken. So he heard that Rome had died. So, oh, he reacted. So they
He
say,
thought it was his chicken. Yeah,
yeah, I thought it was his chicken. He cried out and said, and yet it has just eaten from my hands. And the eunuch, comprehending his words, said that it was the city of Rome which had perished at the hands of Alaric. And the emperor, with a sigh of relief, answered quickly, but I thought that my foul Rome had perished. So great, they say, was the folly with which this emperor was possessed.
That's crazy. I mean, and absolutely nothing comparable to some of the really impressive Roman emperors
By the way, this was not dementia. He was just 27 at the time.
that
Perhaps he
he
was a
thought that.
half-wit. We don't know for sure what was his problem, but it's definite. We know for sure that there was no leadership at the time.
Right. And if you did go to speak to him, he might have no understanding of what you're talking about.
Or no interest, because he didn't even live within Rome, so it didn't bother him personally.
Right. He was detached from it.
Yes, that's just one of those incredible stories that illustrate how bad leadership contributes to the decline of civilizations.
Like if we couldn't get rid of Biden, the situation we would eventually end up in.
Yes, and I'll just finish the story by saying that officially the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, existed until 476 AD, when the barbarian warlord Odoacer deposed the last emperor Romulus Augustus, who at the time was only 11 years old. He was just a figurehead. So, in a state of turmoil, in a state of constant war, the empire exists for another 60 years, but of course, it's greatly diminished, it's weakened, it bears no resemblance to the might of Rome, at its height during the days of Augustus and the days of Trajan and Hadrian.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely not comparable any longer at the end there. Well, I think that was a great way to end this. To everybody who was watching, thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next conversation. Oren, thank you so much for your insight, and I do look forward to speaking with you next time.
thank you for listening to the Silver Hermit podcast. If you like this content, please donate in the link which appears in the description below. Please subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends and family. Hit the bell icon to be notified whenever I release a new video. Remember, I'm not a licensed financial advisor. This video is intended for general informational purposes only and should not be regarded as investment advice. Before taking any investment decision, please consult with a professional financial advisor who may assess your personal investment objectives and needs.